I'm sharing, as you can see, on mental time travel, self-projection, and personality growth. I will give a little bit of a background on the title before I proceed. What it is I very much, sorry, did someone say something? It might be worth muting yourselves on that end because I can hear feedback. Well, some background on what it is I'm doing. My research is on the notion of mental time travel, which is how we think about the past and how we think about the future. And I will say a bit more about that in a second. And all the while, whilst taking this amazing and wonderful course, I kept wondering how I could weave in what I was learning with what I was currently researching to make it as relevant as possible. And I think this topic brings both of those things together very nicely. And actually, I hope in a way that, in an innovative way that not very many people are currently looking at. So a caveat about the scope and structure. This is the scope and structure of the manuscript rather than the scope and structure of this presentation. There are overlaps. So in the first part, I consider the idea of personality growth in psychology because my primary audience, I think, will be theologians and maybe philosophers and maybe some cognitive neuroscientists and people interested in that intersect. I do have to explain what personality growth is and how it is measured in psychological science. Working in philosophy, I have to raise some philosophical and scientific issues with the very notion of personality growth. And then I argue that self-projection, or at least what I term self-projection, via mental time travel aids personality growth. I think it can be detrimental to it as well, in a way that I will explain as we go along. So this argument uses embodied constructivism as a model of the phenomenon of mental time travel. Embodied constructivism is the model of mental time travel that I'm advancing in my research, and it weaves together a constructivist idea of memory with an inactive model of cognition. Mainly a constructivist idea of memory, and this is important to this paper, is the idea that memory is not archival, so we don't go into a storehouse, as it were, and reproduce static impressions when we remember. When we remember, what we're doing is an active construction in the moment, very much like when we think about the future. And this idea entails the idea of mental time travel, which I will talk about on the next slide. But just wanted to give you a very brief idea of embodied constructivism. And then I review current experimental psychology literature of retrospection and prospection in relation to personality growth. I find that in psychology, the terms preferred for memory and for future-directed thinking are retrospection and prospection. And then finally, using Vladimir Lossky's and Thea Deschardins, who are both theologians, and Deschardins is also a scientist, using their criticisms on individualism in relation to defining personhood, as well as drawing on current understandings from social cognition and social psychology. I critique an individualist view of personhood and personality growth. So first, what is mental time travel? Mental time travel is the idea that when we think about the future, what we're doing is that we are mentally traveling forward in time to pre-live events in the future. And when we remember the past, what we're doing is we're mentally traveling back in time to relive events that have taken place in time. And the idea is that these two processes are continuous, so they're in the same continuum, and they are very much for some constructivists, like I am, they're very much the same thing. That is, we simulate the memories, we simulate past events, and we simulate future events in exactly the same manner. What I will say at this point is when I first started my research, mental time travel and the constructivist view of memory and imagination were very much the niche view. And in just a few years of some very active research in cognitive neuroscience, it looks like we are right, the constructivist is right, in asserting that in particular, episodic memory of the past and episodic future-directed thinking are similar or the same cognitive processes. By episodic memory, I mean memory of events rather than semantic memory, memory of facts. So mental time travel in psychology started to, it did sort of emerge from psychology. I am in my research tracing it all the way back to the 4th century to St. Augustine. But for this work, it's important to just, it doesn't matter. I don't need to go back to Augustine. What is important is that it started to re-emerge as a view in psychology with people like Suddendorf and Corbalis, arguing that when we think about the past and when we think about the future, we're doing something very similar. And they also argue that non-human animals do not have this same cognitive ability, that it is something that is very much unique to human beings. I'd be interested in finding out what you think about this view. So I've spoken a little bit about embodied constructivism. I don't think I want to say too much more just because of for time considerations. But really what is important is that idea that memory and imagination are intertwined, interrelated, interconnected phenomena, and also that they are embodied. It is not something, thinking isn't this abstract thing that's removed from our bodies and from our environment. When we think, when we feel, it is something that is generated by our active navigation and our embeddedness within our environment. So what I started on this particular work in IRP, what I wanted to do at first was to do a literature review, looking at work in psychology that are looking in this area of retrospection and prospection in relation to personality growth. It's been really a hard slug because not many people are doing this, and I'm going to look at some statistics in a minute. But here are some terms with which I began. So I use retrospection and prospection, episodic memory, episodic future-directed thinking, and autobiographical memory. Usually people talk about autobiographical memory, which is memory of narratives in our past. It's a combination of episodic and semantic memory. So I remember where I grew up, the name of the town, which would be semantic, and some of the events that took place, which are episodic memories. And then the focus in the literary field in psychology is on semantic memory rather than episodic memory, or where episodic memory is investigated, is often conflated with semantic memory. And then a key assumption is an archival rather than a constructivist model of memory. So not very many people are looking at this phenomenon of mental time travel. And many people assume that memory are just static representations that we reproduce when we remember versus dynamic imaginings that we construct when we think about the future. So that's the assumption, although cognitive neuroscience is very much challenging that assumption. And then, as I see it, not enough attention is paid to the social dimension of memory. Most, if not all, of the studies focus on the individual experience of remembering and thinking about the future. And not only that, but doing it in the first person rather than allowing for what we call perspectival flexibility. So in perspectival flexibility is the idea that when I remember this presentation, for example, tomorrow, I can remember it from very many perspectives, not just from the first person one. So in psychology, two main foundational texts for looking at prospection in particular are the ones by Gilbert and Wilson and also by Seligman. If I had more tech know-how, I will share this text on my screen, but I will quickly summarize them because they're important for a number of reasons. The first is looking at their methodologies, and I would say this is the kind of thing that I probably would not have been sensitive to before taking this course. And via this course, I've learned to analyze the methods and indeed critique it. So very interestingly, Gilbert and Wilson didn't carry out any of their own studies. They mainly drew on neurological studies, which were interesting, and I had no real issues with them, just looking at the network, the default network responsible for prospection. And the second one was a little bit problematic. They drew on psychological study that requested participants to measure how happy they are given certain cues, and they were just students in a library. So I had lots of criticisms about the setup of the design setup, the participants, lack of variance. To what degree can you trust people self-reporting on to what degree to the degree of their happiness in relation to another group? I think there are problems there. All the same, the paper's core claim is still important, and I think that's because it is intuitive, and there are other things that we can use to arrive at that conclusion. That is the idea that we use future representations to make decisions or for action guidance. So when we represent the future, it tends to influence, guide, or indeed affect how we act, how we go on to act, or how we act in the present. And the second paper by Seligman does engage with the one by Gilbert and Wilson, which means it wasn't perhaps influenced by them. What is interesting, unlike Gilbert and Wilson, they don't assume an archival model of memory. They are closer to a mental time travel account. So they describe memory and expectation as quite similar phenomena, which are very interesting. And the methods they use, though, are studies on non-human animals. But recall that I said someone like Suddendorf and Kobalis argue that non-human animals cannot mentally travel to the past or to the future, mainly because they do not have, according to S&C, they do not have this ability to think about episodes or of events. So I wondered to what degree can we go from those studies on non-human animals to make assertions about human cognition in relation to prospection. All the same, I agree with the idea that simulation of the future is used for planning and guides behavior. What I found particularly interesting is the idea that simulations of the future are continuous and occur in various ways, providing multiple possibilities requiring sophisticated probabilistic thinking. So from very different kinds of conscious and non-conscious representations, we try to determine which ones are the ones most likely to occur. And so we then tailor our behavior and our planning to those ones that are most likely to occur. So when I started to look at the literary landscape, going beyond those articles, these are some of the statistics I encountered. So mental time travel, there isn't that much on it. So I had about 382 results, and this is from the PubMed search fields. Then personality growth, again, not so many, but then nothing for mental time travel and personality growth. Again, nothing for mental time travel and Big Five. Similarly, prospection and personality growth, nothing. So instead of, I took out growth and then it became more interesting. I came across studies in the intersect of prospection and personality. And these are some of the key findings from that review. Studies in this area, so in personality and prospection, range from neuroscientific studies to self-reporting following cues. Of the 17 results, about 10 involved the same researcher. And I think so that's problematic because they were quite focused on what they were looking at. They were mainly looking at this idea of how we procrastinate and also how we put things off. And some of the studies weren't entirely relevant. For example, they were focused on the functionality of memory in relation to prospection or inner speech and self-reflection. I mean, it is sort of relevant, but not directly relevant, especially in the area of self-reflection. So because if we were looking at if there are mechanisms for self-projection or prospection that mold our personality, maybe one of those mechanisms involve or is realized by self-reflection. So there was a considerable range in the number of participants in studies from 20 to 700. What I also noticed, although it wasn't always explicitly said, is that prospection covers a range of future representations. So everything from semantic, some were affective. So they were about, sorry, but I said treats to self, but is threats to self. So to what degree do I perceive that a threat is lurking out there in the future? Then some of prospection was used for episodic or a conflation of all of these. So prospection is only always in the first person. And I think there is scope to allow there for perspectival flexibility. And then there are correlations between prospection and some personality traits. So like greed, procrastination, and self-control and neuroticism. So it was positive, I thought, the initial findings, but littered with a lot of potential issues. Some conclusions, immediate ones. There is a correlation between prospection and personality. Of course, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. The correlation between prospection and personality is not necessarily positive. This is witnessed in studies on greed and anxiety. Indeed, in some studies, being able to think about the future made people more greedy. So that means that there is at least another factor required for a positive outcome in relation to personality growth from prospection. So what is, or are those wonderful ingredients that we can add to prospection to enable positive personality growth? And if there is time, here is a quick look at some of scope for future research. I think widening the net, and that one's for me. So I'm going to go on to do more search, but use individual personality trait words. So not just personality. I will use things like, I don't know, temperance. I'm thinking of cardinal virtues, but I will use personality growth like neuroticism and the ocean. I think the Big Five ocean traits. And then in psychology studies, there is more scope to explore further the link between personality traits and episodic future-directed thinking using multiple methods. so neurocognitive, self-reporting, and involving as many varied participants as possible. And I think this one's really important, but I don't know how possible over several years to monitor development. Then design of experiments that allow for and to better understand the social dimension of prospection. Then finally, determine whether the apparent correlation between prospection and personality is causal, not just an apparent correlation. So I want to say a massive thank you to the organizers of this course. I've enjoyed pretty much every session. I keep going back to the Moodle page. Is a wealth of, is a treasure, is a treasure chest for me, and I keep finding new and wonderful things there. I'm very grateful also to Jenna for all her organizing, all her lectures, and listening to us going on and on about how much we were struggling as philosophers and theologians with some concepts and some assumptions in psychology. Thank you very much. I think you guys are muted, so I can see hands up. So I'm guessing maybe someone said questions.
Who was it first? Sorry, I was. Hi, Buki, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. Hi, my name is Amber Griffith. Nice to kind of virtually meet you. Thank you for this. It's really interesting. I just wanted to ask, or kind of make a suggestion. I mean, I know that towards the end you were more interested in like prospection and personality, but in terms of the mental time travel stuff, one place that you might look is at some of the research that, like, I think it's like Maggie Schauer and Thomas Albert did in Constance about narrative exposure therapy with people suffering from PTSD. So basically they claim that, you know, people suffering from PTSD often tend to relive their traumatic experiences, have flashbacks and so on, have these kind of hot memories, so sort of in some sense transported to the very moment of the trauma. And they found that by trying to kind of transform these hot memories into cold memories, or by linking them up with narratives surrounding, so giving a kind of narrative context as opposed to this event being like an interruption in the self-narrative, that people are then able to actually remember as opposed to relive, and that ends up being more adaptive. And it sounds to me like that would be really interesting to think about from the mental time travel approach and the embodied constructivist approach, but also with respect to personality growth and kind of coming out of trauma and adversity and so on. So that might just be some place that you could look in the future to see if there's anything there for you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very interesting. Because I don't specialize in trauma, I did see studies in PTSD, anxiety. It is interesting. I think maybe what they're doing there is not so much as to stop people reliving those memories, but changing their affective responses to memories. I think because I think Gilbert and Wilson mentioned the fact that when people remember things, they then have an effective memory, an effective response in the present. And that is what makes a memory feel emotional, or future directed thinking feel emotional. So I wonder if that's what they're doing, but I will go and have a look, and that's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. You can hear me, right?
Very well, yeah, thank you. Hi.
Okay, very good. No, very good to see you. So thanks for that. Very interesting. I'm fascinated by memory. So what I want to ask you is about this concept of mental trauma. I'm not exactly sure what it means. So let's now imagine that my memory works like an archival memory. I have an archival memory, and you have more embodied, enacted type of memory. If I recall something from my past, why am I not mentally time traveling? if you recall something from your past, why are you mentally time traveling? That's my question. So how, what does it mean, and why did we use this term mental time travel in order? Because we're not really time traveling anyway, are we? No, I'm not moving towards time, and we're not moving in. I mean, I'm not time traveling actually. So mental time travel, and that sounds like a metaphor. Why don't we use this word? So you get what I'm going at. Yeah.
I think that's a great question because it touches on a lot of stuff that I could not cover in that short presentation. It's a massive, the very idea that you describe it as mental time travel means that you're saying that the process by which you mentally go back in time versus the process by which you mentally go forward in time are on a continuum, or they are the same, which is what makes it mental time travel, is one generic thing. If you have an archival form of memory, you have a slightly different, you have a different system for generating memories versus for imagining the future, which means that you can't say that memory and future-directed thinking are on a continuum. They're quite very, very different cognitive phenomena in that way. Does that clarify? Yes, yeah.
And I think we have Ekan and then. Okay. And then Catherine.
Hello, Buki. It was fascinating for the first time I heard this term, mental time traveling. So just a question about future two. Tomorrow,
yes.
Future two. Tomorrow I shall not listen to your talk, or when I shall be dead. Yes, I shall have lived on this earth. So this is an important tense future too. How do you imagine this time traveling? So, because I know, for instance, in psychotherapy, for instance, in hypnotherapy, we work with age regressions. So from one phase to the other. But what about future two?
I don't think I completely understand the question.
I shall have listened to your talk. This is future two.
Yes, it sounded like you started by asking a question on tense, on the future tense, and then something about age regression in psychotherapy. But I don't see how to connect to see it as a question.
Let's say what is quite familiar to me is a question in so going to the past.
Yes.
And for instance, psychotherapy is a method we can offer to travel to the past.
Yes.
In our imagination, or for instance, in hypnotherapy, for instance.
Yes.
But what is much more amazing for me would be time traveling to future two.
Okay.
In other words, having a kind of perspective from the future to the past, towards the past.
So maybe I think we're saying the same thing, if I understand you correctly, that when we go forward in time, something about that imagining, that representation of the future can shape your autobiographical memory or how you think about the past. But I think that's kind of what maybe an underlying assumption that I was making. But I don't know if that's precisely what you were asking. I don't know if I've done your question justice.
Perhaps I will read a little bit the references you there's
Yes.
the verdict of Glickman and the other types. Okay. But
Thank
anyway, thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
We have Catherine, and then we have Sandra.
Okay, hi, Buki, thanks so much, that was a really interesting, project of yours, and
Hi,
I'm curious to
Kath.
see what you do with it. In philosophy, and I think psychology, there are some ideas that actually try to define like your subjective sense of self in terms of a past narrative. So in terms of, past time travel, who you think of yourself as in the past kind of is somehow like essential to who you are. It seems, but all of these ideas understand, the relevant self-making narrative as one that happens in the past. But I wonder if, kind of on the basis of some of the things you were saying, people who want to, closely connect the notion of the self with the narrative might do just as well or better to connect it with one's future projections of who one wants to develop into, the kind of life trajectory they pick for themselves. And that seems an underexplored area in this kind of overlap of philosophy and psychology and definitions of the self. And do you have any thoughts on that and how it relates to?
I mean, that's precisely what I was arguing. That is an under-researched area, how future representations of ourselves, but also of others, is why I was stressing perspectival flexibility. So imagining how my actions now will affect you tomorrow by imagining how you might react to how I treat you. It shapes who we are eventually. It's is my suspicion, but it's so under-researched that it's difficult to arrive at that conclusion from the data that I have, but it signs point to that.
Thank you.
Sandra?
Yes. Hi, Buki. Thanks for a great lecture. And I do hope we see this in conference this summer. When you are talking about memory, I'm very interested in the concept of forgetting, because we can learn how to memorize things, but we cannot somehow learn to forget things like ars oblivionalis. It's like an impossible technique. So I was just wondering, can you give us some input about forgetting and oblivion in activism and constructionism that you mentioned?
Forgetting in relation to constructivism, is that what you said?
Yes, and both constructionism. Yes.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant question, which I will not be able to answer really well, but I will send you a link, a reference to a paper, which is written by Kirken McKillian. He's one of the leading voices in philosophy of memory, but also on constructivism. And he's just written a paper on forgetting in the idea of constructivism. So if you say that memory just is like imagining the future, and it just is something that I've constructed in the present, how then do you justify forgetting? What is that then? Because you really can't forget anything if you can just construct. But he then argues that that's not the case, and gives, I think, what he's arguing, because for him, it doesn't talk about true or wrong or false memory. He talks about successful or unsuccessful memory. So to what degree is that remembering successful in achieving its aim? And so what he argues for is that forgetting is what happens when the cognitive systems that we're using to generate episodic memory fail. So it's a failure in the system. But it's a brilliant question, because it's something I'm still trying to see if I agree with his answer, and also looking at it in relation to St. Augustine's view on forgetting. Because for Augustine, forgetting is when we perceive an image of the concept forget. So it's a very, very different take. And Augustine is the original constructivist. So it's a brilliant question. Thank you.
Okay. Do we know who was first? Okay.
Thank you very much. A fascinating discussion and topic. I noted that on one of your slides, you utilized Paradise Ardennes and philosophy's work, in part, I think with respect to a critique of individualism, with respect to personhood, but I wonder if you could speak a bit further to either Teilhard or Losky and how you're utilizing them or what insight they offer to the project.
Okay. If I heard you correctly, I think you said something about with reference to one of my earlier slides, where I mentioned Teilhard and Losky on their critiques on individualism.
That's right.
Yes. So you wanted me to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, if you could, just what sort of insights they offered you in
I found it interesting. Both of those thinkers are very much interested in anthropology and what it is that makes us human. It sounds like you know who they are already. But I found it interesting because I was thinking in that direction about the fact that we tend to think about personhood, selfhood in terms of the individual. And indeed, it's reflected in all the design setups of all these experiments. But they say that that's actually a very wrong way of looking at what a person is. So they are anti-individualist in that sense. And they give a community-focused, a society-focused definition of what it is that makes us people. It is other people. And I really very much agree with that. And I wonder, though, if part of it is because I use a lot of Aquinas in my work, and he thinks the same thing. I think it's just a monastic way of being where the focus is on the community rather than the person. I could say a whole lot more because it's something I'm fascinated with, but if you like, I can send you the specific references where they talk about those things.
Sure, yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
And for the last question, right?
Hi, Buki. It's good to see you, and thank you for your call.
Yeah, I'm so sorry I missed yours. I really wanted to hear it.
So with your talk being about, or your project being about mental time travel to the past and mental time travel to the future, their relationship to potentially the personality growth, I wondered if you might find it to be like a profitable foil to engage with as part of your project, kind of popular-ish idea that, well, what really matters is that you live in the now, that sort of like present moment focus. And I think maybe there is some psychological research that's at least somewhat connected to that kind of idea, like mindfulness tends to be connected to that idea, flow is connected to that idea. I think there's plenty of room personally for both the kind of perspective that you're wanting to engage with about the importance of mental time travel and that kind of view, but at least the extreme versions of it be like kind of foil. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
No, that's a brilliant critique. I hope it's something that does come out because I always talk about, well, again, I keep going back to Augustine because he is who I'm working on. He talks about the future in relation to the present, the past in relation to the present. So it is always in relation to now. It is we look to the future or to the past to know how to act or how to be in the now. One of the things that but only using conceptual methods, I'm going to offer is the idea of attention, which is a thing that's becoming more and more popular. So I'm going to argue that prospection, in addition to attention, paying attention to the now, to the other in the now, is what enables personality growth. But it's a conceptual thing. And maybe it of course is subject to experimental and empirical methods.
Thank you, Buki. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.